Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And we've got an excellent class by Master Gardener, Laurel today. And we're going to be recording this class once again, and this will be available under our community resources page, as well as via an email after the class. So look forward to that. Everyone should be on mute, I believe. Let me see if folks are still coming in. And I think we are pretty much ready to get this class going. So Laurel, I'm going to turn it over to you, and the class is all yours.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for joining. And this is edible container gardening. It's primarily focused on the San Francisco Bay Area, but if you're from elsewhere, most of the techniques or the rules are the same. And also, if you want to grow flowers or something else in a container, same premise. There's just a few little things usually for edibles that you need to know. Also, just I guess my background, I am a master gardener. That means that I've gone through a training program specific to this county. There are master gardener programs nationally. I think there might be internationally, but somebody will correct me on that. So if you're in a different county and you would like to have specific information on gardening, look them up, and I'm sure they'd be happy to help you. Also, I own a container gardening business. I've been doing that for 6 years. Mostly we do seasonal ornamental, flowers and color and that kind of thing. Although we do some vegetable gardening or citrus trees, etc. And I think I've been gardening for longer than half my life. So at that point, hopefully I've picked up a few things, but you always learn something new. Let's see. The first thing, I'm just going to close. There's a couple of things that keep popping up on my screen. Container gardening, anyone can do it, and you can do it almost anywhere. I've seen it hanging on walls, on balconies, on railings. What I like about container gardening is you don't have to worry about the soil or the roots of the big trees, or if you even have a yard. So you can do it anywhere. You can grow almost anything in a container. I've grown cherry trees. That was probably the biggest thing, and actually had some good production. So it's something that I think is easy for people to take advantage of. This is probably one of the key things you need to do. It's not probably your first step. The first thing is usually, it's March or April and it's spring and you see tomato plants in the nursery, or your friend or your neighbor has done it and you think that's what I want to do. But actually, you really should start with knowing what your environment is, how much sun, shade, and by sun, I mean sun that actually hits the plant or the space. The orientation of the sun, are you facing south, east, west, north? How much wind, or are there times of day or times of the year that are really windy? Is there nearby stone, concrete? That's actually an advantage if you don't have a lot of space or a lot of sun, because heat also plays a component. Do you have a problem with deer, raccoon? Do you have a lot of people who will walk by that area? For that situation, you want to think about, are people going to help themselves to your hard work, or catch themselves on something spiky, or accidentally knock something over? You want to make sure you're not too close to a lot of foot traffic. Water, certainly. Is there a faucet nearby? Are you going to be able to hook something up? And if you're on a balcony or a roof, is there a maximum weight limit? Wet pots are very heavy. A gallon of water is, I think, almost 8 pounds. So imagine that in the soil, that can really add up. Next. This is a micro view of, or a close-up view of microclimates. This is sort of what could happen just in your own space. So I don't know if you see my cursor here, but this little stone wall on the sunny side reflects heat, and it will also keep that heat going after the sun's come down. That does affect evaporation, but it also helps give a little oomph to those things that like it. On the other side, it cools down the ground. It may block wind. It also may make a little eddy there, but just so you can see the effects of just even a small stone fence. When you go to the nursery, which is a little later in my talk, you're going to see these different things: full sun, part shade. Well, what do they mean? And there's a little variation, but generally full sun means 6 hours of direct sun. That plant, if it's got a tag that says that, needs 6 hours or more. Part sun, 4 to 6, part shade. It needs something. I say 1.5 to 4, maybe 2 to 4. Full shade is really never 0. Full shade means there's some reflected light or something, or a little bit of dappled. Chilled hours, those come into play when you're growing blueberries, certain fruit trees, where that fruit or that plant needs to be kind of dormant, and it gets dormant at those hours. I mean, at those temperatures, 32 to 45, and it needs so many of those, I guess, to really produce a good sweet fruit. In Northern California, we don't have a lot of chill hours. I mean, there are varieties that adapt. There are blueberries, southern blueberries, that do better. There are cherry trees with less chill hours and some of those. So you want to look around specifically for those. So, like I said, you've probably already decided what you want to grow, but you really should go back and think about what is your environment. And if you live in a mild climate, like Northern California, if you live near the coast or even on the peninsula, you really have a mild summer. And so you maybe want to consider dwarf, or what they call patio varieties. They usually have a shorter growing season. They usually don't grow large fruit because they don't have the time, but you'll have a successful experience. I've grown delicious cantaloupe that are, you know, as big as a softball, and I don't have the heat for anything more than that. I generally grow cherry tomatoes, maybe, you know, something in the saladette size. It's hard to grow a beefsteak tomato in those situations. Inland, you have a bit more opportunity to get some, you know, big melons, big tomatoes, etc. But you may as well, you know, accept your limitations and have something that's pleasant than trying to fight Mother Nature. If you really only have shade, you're really looking at leafy greens, maybe herbs. The great thing about containers is you can chase the sun. So if you're willing to put in that effort, you might be able to get something. And you can grow cucumbers. This is a little watermelon here, anything really in a pot, as long as you have the support. It's not difficult. You just have to plan for that. Other things, size of your desired harvest. I noticed last year with the pandemic, everything closed down, but nurseries were open and people flocked to the to go buy a bunch of tomato plants, vegetable seedlings, etc. And that's great. And I hope people really learned a lot and had a lot of fun. But if you are trying to produce food as a supplement to whatever you could find in the store, you have to grow a lot of food. You have to think about how many people and what are they going to eat, and do you have the space? Also, how easy is it to access it? You don't want so many pots that you can't walk through to reach all sides of it. Or if you have a raised bed, you don't want one so deep that you can't touch the middle or the other side. So think about those things when you're trying to figure out how much you're going to put in there. These this picture is, there's a company, boy, I can't remember, because those are at a restaurant we used to do. But they're really great, you know, for moving around. They have drainage. They were food safe plastic. You could probably make something like that, but it was handy if you've got a bad back and you don't want to bend over too far. I will talk later. You don't want to have a whole bunch of things growing in just one container, but this was a decorative thing. It was more of a visual. They wanted lots of herbs and things in those, and we just changed out baby plants all the time. Citrus. So citrus is, I think, the other most popular plant that people think about growing in a container. They really need a lot of sun. They want 6 hours minimum. If you're in a space where in the winter, maybe you only get 3 or 4 hours, but in the summer you get 8 hours, that's probably fine. I have one, it's not in a pot, it's in the ground, but is exactly in that situation, and it's great. You want the biggest pot possible for citrus. I see people with, I don't know, 10 by 10 inch pots trying to grow a citrus tree. And while they may sell it that way, it doesn't really make that citrus plant very happy unless you're going to put it in a big pot right away. The bigger the pot, that particular lemon has been in there for probably 7 years. That pot is maybe 30 inches high by 16 inches wide, and has been pretty happy. And in fact, we do plant flowers around the bottom, and that has never hurt that plant. They are big feeders, so you need to do a consistent fertilizing program. They may need root prunes. Citrus, if you're really going to only grow it in a pot, may after so many years just be so tight and root bound, and the soil so used up that you need to take it out, shave the sides of the roots and the bottom, replace the soil, and put it back in. Doing that and transplanting sometimes will put a citrus into shock and mess up its fruit cycle. So you could lose a year of fruit production. Don't be worried if you buy a new lemon or tangerine or whatever, take it home, plant it, and you don't see blossoms or fruit. If you've got green leaves and it looks happy, just let it settle, and it will take a little while. Oh, by the way, I will stay and answer questions as long as questions, you know, people enter them, I'm guessing, on chat. So don't worry about that. I will stay as late as Can will let us if you've got questions. This is a lemon that, two things, probably is in too small of a pot and gets watered. Sometimes it gets watered too much. Sometimes it doesn't get watered enough. So it stresses the yellow leaves. That can mean it needs iron or magnesium, or again, it's just been watered too much. The color leaves, and the lack of leaves are your first clue, although there's fruit and there are blossoms. So it's not on its last legs. You will want to consider the supplemental iron or magnesium. You do not need to prune citrus if they've grown out of their space or a branch is way out of the, to the left or right. Sure, cut it back. But a lot of small pruning creates what I'd call scabby, scattered little weak stems. And that's really not great for the fruit. So if you're going to cut something back, cut it back to where there's another branch shooting off, or if you can, make bigger cuts, not lots of small cuts. Don't shape your citrus into a lovely, topiary. If you want a topiary plant, find something else. Or kumquats have smaller leaves and tend to have a more circular shape, I guess, kind of hold their shape. Let me see. Oh yeah, they do appreciate anything with a thick leaf, and I will mention that again at the end. But usually accumulates dust. At least in California, we don't have summer rain, so you want to kind of wash them off periodically, because that dust and dirt does make a nice little home for some small pests that can cause problems. And then also the leaves can just breathe better. So as part of the timing as to whether when's a good time or a bad time to plant, our master gardeners have on our website a place where you can find really helpful calendar here. I'm sorry, I keep getting something saying there's this one person trying to enter the waiting room. I don't know why it keeps flashing here, so I'm just mentioning that to you.
Yeah, Laurel, there's a whole bunch of tech issues going on at the moment. So folks are just trying to have a hard they're having a hard time joining and hearing and full screen. Everything's working fine for a lot of folks. So to me, it's full screen. I see you, no problem, but some are experiencing some delays. So
okay, that's fine. I'm sorry to interrupt everyone. And if you again, I'm happy to stay if people come in late or have a problem or have a question. So right here, I'm trying to show you our first page and our second page. If you come to our website, it's Master Gardeners of San Mateo and San Francisco counties. This is a calendar and information specific to our area. You go to resources on our master page, and then you come to under resources, there's vegetable, fruits, and something, herbs. If you click on that, you will get a page which has a section on timing, and it will have hot, sunny, coastal, or shady. And if you click on one of those, you're going to get a calendar that looks like this, which is super helpful. It's actually, I think, adapted from a book by Pam Pierce, who has written about gardening in the San Francisco Bay Area, especially vegetable gardening. But it was adapted by a master gardener in our group, and it shows which months you can either do seeds are a good idea, or you want to do transplants, or you have an option of both. And so it's very helpful. And sunny areas is maybe different than the coastal area. So I would encourage you, if you're curious and want to know what's a good time to plant what. Actually, obviously, April, it's a lot of things. But if you're looking at cool weather things, you're gonna wait till maybe, it says July or August, whatever works. And I would assume, people from other areas might be able to make some analogous interpretation. We're zone 9B, but I've also seen 10A occasionally. So that's what these are generally for. So in considering, and I'm assuming a lot of people haven't done this before, but seeds are great in some situations. You can try a lot of different varieties that are only available by seed that you won't find in your local nursery. And it's not expensive to try. Some seedlings don't really transplant well if they've got a taproot, so radishes or carrots, that kind of thing. So it's better to just get them in the ground, in the pot, whatever you're doing, and leave them there. As I said, it's less expensive also if you want to grow a lot of something. You want a lot of lettuce or a lot of arugula or kale. Getting a pack of seeds is cheaper than buying several starts. For plants, obviously get a jump start on the growing season, and then it's easier to get a variety of them. You can get, I end up buying 10 different kinds of tomato plants just because I don't know when to say no. There are only 3 of us at home, so it's a lot of tomatoes. And you can get some, interesting things like this grafted tomato. I'm not necessarily an advocate of one kind or another, but you'll see things out there that can be interesting. And something like a blueberry plant, I'm not going to grow from whatever it's grown from, seed or graft or whatever. I'm just going to buy a blueberry plant and stick it in the ground. So you've kind of figured out what you want and what you can grow in your area, and you go to the nursery. And what should you do? Should you grab the first one you see? Now you should look for something. They're probably not going to let you pull it out of the container, but I often squeeze a pot and kind of try to look down the side to see if I can see any roots, or you look in the bottom of the pot to see what's going on. You would like nice white roots, good stems coming out, sturdy, no smell of rot or sulfur, a proper leaf color, whatever the proper leaf color should be, a balanced shape, ideally some signs of new growth, new leaves or whatever. You don't want to get something that already has a sign of disease, really, really root bound, a little bit of pest. If one leaf has a little pest disease or damage, and it's really just limited to maybe one leaf, I'm not so worried about that. Once you see disease, there's more that you can't see there, so I would really avoid that. And then for sort of fruit trees and things, you want to watch out if it looks like there's a bunch of the roots going around the neck. That's called girdling, and that can eventually strangle your plant. So I know it's really hard when they only have 1 or 2 of the plant you really, really want, and you've gone to the effort to put on your mask and get out there and stand in line. But I find I can kill a plant all by myself. I don't need anybody to help me along with that. So I think I should, start with the best chance possible for success. And you should too. It's hard sometimes to really, get a plant back to good health to help it survive. So go out there and get the best one that you can. And if you don't know, a lot of independent nurseries, at least in this area, are very helpful in giving you good information about what looks like a good plant. I have always been really happy with the individual ones giving me, good, honest information because they want you to come back too. What you don't want is, and this happens, you'll start to see this probably even in June, small vegetable plants that already have fruit. They've sat in those pots for a long time. And the point of a annual vegetable plant or fruit or whatever is to propagate, to produce seed, to go, continue the species in the world. So that plant is stressed, the one with the little red peppers, and it's thinking, I gotta get my, my plants, my seeds going so that they can be eaten by a bird or fall on the ground or whatever it is they need to do. Oh my God. It is never going to grow to its full potential once you put it in a bigger pot. It'll grow. You'll get more, but you will never get as much as if you had gotten one that was younger, hadn't sat in a small pot for too long, wasn't stressed. Sometimes the nurseries will up pot. They'll take that 4-inch container and put it in a gallon or something, and then there may be some fruit production. Then, it's up to you, the time of year. It's probably less stunted. The other picture is more about flowers, which is if you're growing something that's only going to do, say, annual flowers or maybe even perennial, there's usually only a set number of months that they produce those flowers. So you usually don't want to get a pot that is already in full bloom because you've kind of missed half of the joy from it. You want something that, maybe has some buds already, so you're not waiting forever, and isn't too small. Pots. So there are all kinds of containers out there, and there are more every day. It's kind of a personal choice for the most part. The only thing I will say about metal from here is in a hot spot, metal can burn roots. And and they can leach depending on what the metal is. So you want to think about that for anything that you might eat. But even for a decorative situation, I know metal containers are very stylish and popular. I probably mentioned this later, but we line them with coconut core, or I suppose if you had some big pieces of styrofoam from a something that was shipped to you, you could use that too. But I like the coconut core, and it helps make a little mat against the metal and keep those roots a little safer. You want to, there are some considerations with the different types. Stone, terracotta, and concrete, they retain some of that heat overnight, keeping the soil warm. And for summer plants, summer vegetables, generally you need a soil temperature, I think around 60. Supposedly you don't want evenings cooler than 50. I know sometimes here where I live on the peninsula that it takes a while for the nights to be as warm as 50, but the concrete and the terracotta kind of keep the soil warmer longer. So that's a benefit for me. Now, black nursery pots can increase the temperature by 10 degrees. So if I had enough sun and I had a protected area where I could keep it warmer at night, I could start gardening even earlier in the year because my soil temperature would be warmer. Different containers have different evaporation rates. Terracotta, water's gonna, soak into that pot and cause more evaporation. But I happen to like terracotta. I haven't had too much problem. I don't like self-watering pots. I know they sell them. you know, there's new versions all the time. My issue with the self-watering pots is, well, there's a couple of things. You've got the pot and you've just put in this new plant. Well, in the self-watering, the water sits down here in a reservoir. Well, your new plant doesn't have, you know, yes, eventually its roots will grow down towards where the water is wicked up a bit, but the water doesn't wick up to the top. It wicks up part way. The bigger problem is that those roots inevitably go down and find that water. Suppose, you know, the self-watering literature on these pots will say they'll stop. But I have found that they don't stop. They grow into that water, they start rotting, and once the rot starts, it travels up the plant and they die. And we have pulled out a fair number of plants that over time have died from that kind of self-watering or sitting in water. Not just self-watering pots, but sitting in water. The other thing is just wet pots, again, are really heavy. You may want to get a little trivet or dolly on wheels. They sell those at, you know, Home Depot, Lowe's, all kinds of places, I'm sure online, if you're going to move the pot around. Most containers that you buy at a store that are for growing plants are fine for edibles. I showed this one with, you know, the herbs in the cans. Presumably they were food safe cans, but I really don't like to use anything I don't know is absolutely food safe. If you're gonna buy something that's made out of wood, or if you're gonna build a little raised bed, use untreated redwood here for California, but teak or cedar. Cedar I know is more an East Coast thing. Don't use a container if you don't know its history, even if it's a old terracotta pot your friend gave you. You don't know what kind of pesticides they might have used or herbicides or what was in it. I just think you shouldn't use something you don't know the background of for food. I might plant, you know, a lovely flowering, you know, shrub or roses or something else in a pot like that, but I wouldn't do it for something I was going to eat. Every year you're supposed to clean out your pot, take out all the old soil, use a 10% bleach or white vinegar solution to kill any leftover pathogens so that you don't contaminate next year's crop. And you should, they talk about dunking your pots in water to really get all the bleach and everything out. The problem is if you have a big pot, I don't have any place to dunk it. So I think if you rinse it thoroughly, let it sit in the sun. I will be honest, and this is not what they will advocate, but if I've grown a tomato plant and I hadn't had any problem with it, I might take just half of the soil out and I kind of use it as a mulch or filler in my yard places. And haven't had any problem with that. And then just add new soil to the top. After a couple of years, I will dump all of it out and start over. But that's kind of what you're supposed to do. Also, plastics with those recycle numbers apparently leach chemicals. So if you're thinking about using something that you have around home, you might think about that. And then lined metal containers with coconut core. Again, I don't really know what metals are food safe or not for growing, but if you find that something is, I'd line it with something so you don't burn your plants or cook them. We talked about this earlier, but you know, mobility, you might want to think about that because leaning over day in, day out, taking care of your plants can be painful on your back. There are standing containers now, or troughs, I guess, you know, raised troughs, which are lovely. I've seen some of them on the internet. That may be something that you would really like. Container, okay. The correct size is key. You want to make sure that it can hold the mature size. So what does that mean? Well, for things like peppers, eggplant, maybe some of the small patio tomatoes, you want to have something at least 10 inches wide, 14 inches deep. That's the equivalent of what they call a 5-gallon black nursery container, which really isn't 5 gallons, but that's another story. So that's really the minimum. For tomatoes and squash, you want something as big as you can get, 18 inches wide, 20 inches deep. That would be pretty good. I had a lot of success in that size with both the zucchini, with 2 zucchini in the same pod, or you know, a tomato. Herbs, carrots, beets, some of those other things, they could be in something shallow. I wrote 10 to 12. I'm sure some of those could even be in 8-inch. It just depends. But the smaller the pot, the more stunted the growth, the smaller the harvest. These plants in the ground, like tomatoes, they can have 3 feet wide root systems or go really deep. So you're kind of limiting their capacity already. So you want to really do the best you can. Feet. Okay, whether you use, some people really want to use a saucer. I'm actually not a fan of saucers because people water drains out, and that's good. You know, it should drain out, but then it sits in that saucer and 2 things happen. One, mosquitoes only need 1/4 of an inch to start laying eggs, and we have had problems with disease in this area. And 2, that water then is also sitting inside the pot at the bottom there, and it encourages the root rot thing, same as the self-watering pots. So you definitely want to make sure it drains. If you really want to have a saucer, prop it up on some of these, any kind of feet you have, and we tell people, take a turkey baster and suck out excess water. You know, if it's a really hot day and only a 1/2 inch of water goes out, it probably will evaporate by the end of the day or next morning. That's not a big deal. But if it's always water there and it's always a couple of inches, eventually it's going to kill your plant. Maybe not this week or next week, but eventually. We use feet even if it's on the ground. I've had pots, empty pots sitting in my driveway or wherever, and it's rained, and I've looked down and they have nice, you know, 1/4 inch size holes, and the water didn't drain. Sometimes the connection between the pot and the ground is so good, the water doesn't really drain. So you want something. The easiest, cheapest, especially if you're doing a lot of pots, is to go somewhere, again, like a Home Depot, a Lowe's, some kind of home building place, and get a sheet of small tiles like you would use for a backsplash in your kitchen or the bathroom. We get stuff that's maybe 2 inches by 2 inches. They're maybe 1/4 inch thick. We just stick them underneath. Nobody sees them, but they make sure that that pot then definitely will drain. Rocks. You know, it used to be common wisdom, or it still is pretty much common wisdom, that you want gravel at the bottom of your pot for good drainage. And actually, there's a whole physics thing about surface tension. The soil really doesn't drain completely when there's a difference. So you don't, it's a whole, you know, water stays at the bottom, your roots rot, etc. I don't think there's anything you really want to put at the bottom to increase it. If you've got a really tall pot and you're growing something pretty small and you don't want to fill the whole thing up, I think the only compromise would be go ahead and put rocks or whatever you want, but then put another pot inside so that what you're planting is a pot full of dirt. You know, if it's sitting then on a pile of rocks, well, that's going to drain. That's fine. But otherwise, do not put them inside. They also shift. I don't care how sharp they are, how whatever. Over time, they shift and block the drainage holes. For some things like succulents, for some California natives, things that really don't want their necks to be near damp water, you should, you can definitely put rocks on top. They're very pretty, but the bottom is a big, and that means also no styrofoam, no chunks of wood, whatever. Potting medium. I know that sounds so fancy. Potting of soil. You really want to buy potting. So there are recipes, people, you know, can make their own version, but you're sort of buying the raw ingredients new. You're not reusing something. It's formulated for plants that are growing in pots. It's got a balanced nutritional profile, good air circulation, good drainage. I personally really like organic blends. Some of them have the mycorrhizal fungi, which can help the roots extend their reach for nutrition. The newer version, there are a lot of new varieties that put something in them to increase moisture retention. And I know in California, we're probably having another bad drought season. Rain was really low and the snowpack's really low. Some of those versions really do, I think, make a difference. We tested a few out. There can be coconut coir added. There can be yucca pulp or something added. So you might want to consider one of those. Garden soil is not a good idea because usually it's, you know, heavy or doesn't do, you know, doesn't drain well. It's not structurally correct. It's not nutritionally balanced. It probably has weed seeds or pests or something else. So better to go get something already bagged and ready to go. And while I say I prefer organic, that doesn't mean it's expensive. I think there are lots of organic blends that are at a decent price point. So just shop around. Sometimes also your nurseries, certain times of year, and you can ask them, will be, you know, buy 3, get the 4th free. So it's another thing to look out for. The only other times you might want another soil blend is if you're doing blueberries, which is the only edible at the moment I can think of, but azaleas or camellias, they're really acid loving plants and they need a lower pH in their soil. And the reason you care about pH is it affects their ability to absorb nutrition. So an alkaline pH would make it really hard for a blueberry to get what it needs. And then succulents and cactus, I actually don't buy separate mix for them, but I will throw in maybe a little extra perlite or vermiculite just to increase the drainage. Generally, people I do succulents for don't water them, even though succulents do need water on occasion. So I like to have a little extra moisture in them. Fertilizer. There are lots of fertilizers out there. And first of all, there's a fertilizer for probably everything, and you really only need a couple basic ones. All of those different versions are usually a marketing ploy so that you buy one for your roses and, you know, one for your sunflowers and one for your, I don't know, tomatoes, etc. You need a balanced one, maybe a blooming or vegetable one, but and then an acidic one. Again, the acidic plants, the blueberries, camellias, azaleas, you really want to keep with that theme of acidic. The other thing that actually I like to use is starter fertilizer in the beginning. It has extra humic acid, which is a bit like Gatorade, that just gives it that little bit of extra energy. The organic fertilizer is the only thing I'll use. It avoids the buildup of salts in the container, which can be a problem. And organic fertilizers not only make a healthy plant because it's more like eating a good diet of food as opposed to taking vitamins every day, which is sort of what I equate the synthetic ones with. And it also helps the soil stay healthy. And a healthy soil has a whole life going on down there that really can help feed your plant and protect your plant. Organic, you're less likely to get crazy fast growth, but that also means you won't get weak growth. And then repeat as the applications say. It varies for all of them. Planting. Before you put something in a container, transplant it, make sure you water it. It can be hard if you put a dry plant into a container of potting soil, sometimes to get that root ball really well hydrated. That plant will be happier and undergo less shock if you water it first. Then you want to make a hole in your pot, put about half of your fertilizer and just stir it a little bit. Take out the plant, tip it out, don't yank on the stem. If that plant really doesn't want to come, kind of need the plastic or stick a chopstick through the bottom hole and try to push it up. You don't want to lose the top because you pull too hard. Loosen the roots. There are some plants that don't like their roots loosened or touched too much. I'm told bean plants don't. Some of them, melons and squash, if they're in a tight knot, they do need to get loosened a bit or they'll stay in a tight knot. You could, just be really careful. You want to try to keep the dirt attached as much as possible because, again, there's probably a whole bunch of stuff that you can't see going on underneath, that the roots and the fungi and the amoeba, whatever, are all related to. You don't necessarily want to rinse the roots free if you can avoid that. You want to tamp it down, not really hard, but you definitely want to make sure it's got contact with the soil. You want to keep plants at their root crown. So wherever the soil was when you bought it, that's where you want to keep it. Put in the rest of the dirt, put in the rest of the fertilizer, water well, really water well. And just a couple of tips, give yourself about an inch below the lip of the container. You don't want to do the dirt all the way up to the top. Otherwise, every time it rains or you water, you get dirt all over the side. So you're much better off if you've got it down a little lower. Don't do it during a heat wave or the hottest time of the day. Sometimes you can't avoid that. You buy something, it really needs transplanted and there's a week-long heat wave. In that case, since it's a container, I would try to move it somewhere shady. Even though it might be a full sun plant, just give it the best chance it can to get through that stress, and then you can move it back out later. The exceptions to not planting something too deep are tomatoes. Those fuzzy little bits along the stem will, if they're in the ground, will actually form roots. And the more roots a plant has, the better it'll grow, the happier it'll be. So for tomatoes, you want to take off, I've kind of done a tiny job here of, you could take off the bottom leaves. If there were more leaves up here, I mean, you could even take off, there's a back one there, maybe that one, but I don't know, for something this small, I might only just take off those two and then plant it closer to that first main leaf. Those bottom ones are probably, you know, the little seedling ones, the cuddle-eight, well, maybe not, but they might have been the first two true ones, but really I go up to a mature one. Then you plant it. If leaves are touching the ground, either pinch them off completely, or sometimes I just cut half the leaf off. Leaves that touch the ground are more likely to get pathogens or be a gateway for pathogens and other problems. So you definitely don't want those touching the ground. I do know as tomatoes grow, some of those older leaves will start to go down. So again, I take them off as they get that close. I have read, not consistently, but leggy transplants like cucumbers, squash, melons, they all have that fuzzy kind of stem, and that you could do a trench and lay them down. They don't suggest pinching off leaves, so you would just do it up to the first leaves. I don't see consistent on that. I don't see consistent on eggplant and peppers, but you know, that's one of those tales that goes around. I think I might not. For those, I might try it for a cucumber or a squash, because I also have read that people who want to grow giant pumpkins sometimes layer back the stem in the ground, cover it with some soil to get extra roots so that their giant pumpkins get extra nutrition towards them. Oh my gosh, you know, I'm on spam alert. I've had like 3 spam calls, and I'm sorry because I'm gonna turn this off in a minute. Okay. Usually when you buy a lot of these plants, even beans, peas, squash, whatever, the growers have thrown several seeds in. They've done that for 2 reasons. One, they want to make sure at least one grows in every cell. 2, if there are 2 growing in that cell, people think they're getting extra plants and are more likely to buy them. So it's sort of a marketing thing. The reality is the roots get tangled up and it's hard for any of them to grow really well. What you want to do is to take each little cell of plants out and use scissors and cut the weakest 1 or 2 off so that you've got 1 left. I know that's hard to do. I've spent many years teasing and dipping in water and trying to separate like beans. Sometimes, you know, if you've got 2 fairly mature bean seedlings and you're lucky, you might be able to separate them and have them both survive, but there's a lot of stress there in pulling those things apart. You really want to just cut one, let its roots decompose and add to the soil, and then plant the healthiest one. This is also when you want to set up your supports, whether it's a trellis or whatever you're doing. And if a hot spell does occur shortly after you've got your seedlings out there, you might want to cover something gently, you know, cover them with something see-through. I talk about netting later, something that gives them a little bit of break from that hot heat. Generally, I don't mulch when I do containers, certainly not ornamentals. There's just not enough room because we pack a lot of flowers and other things in there. For a singular squash or tomato plant, it's probably a good idea. It helps retain the moisture, but you have to think about how much room you have. It's not like when you plant in the ground and you you have infinite space that you can cover and where the roots can benefit from that. You want to be careful. I mean, I know I said you can plant tomatoes deep, but you do want to be careful if you put mulch in a container that you don't bring it up to the neck or the stem of some of those plants, because the moisture will accumulate there and they will rot. And that is really sad. Oftentimes, I mean, this one's really overdone, and actually I can tell that it's a little blurry. You'll see these, it used to be very stylish to do a pizza pot or, you know, salsa pot, and you'd get one of everything. And that's a fun idea, but really it's not good for any of those plants that are in there. You need circulation, otherwise you can get mildew or, you know, some other problems. Also, and just room to grow. The other thing is you want to think about sun orientation. If you've got a series of pots and one gets really big and tall and the next one's something a little smaller, you want to make sure the smaller one is in front, however your sun orientation is, so it doesn't get blocked during the key hours. I know it's really hard with, you know, you get a big pot, you've got your little tiny tomato plant in there and you think, well, can't I put two or something? I am the queen of trying to do that. And believe me, you'd have to have a pretty darn big pot for that to be worth it. Because otherwise, you know, 2 months in, they're completely root bound. You're watering them all the time because there's just no soil left. They're just full of dense roots and the water just runs right through. So if you want to do something while you're waiting for your tomato or squash or whatever to get bigger, you could consider a fast little, well, you could put a couple herbs, annual herbs like a basil in there. You could maybe do radishes or something that's real quick while you're waiting for the plant to get bigger. I do them near the edge. I wouldn't get them near the root ball, but you have to really think about that. If you are going to have more than one plant in a pot, like we had that lemon that had flowers around it, you kind of want to make sure they have similar needs for the water and fertilizer. Otherwise, somebody's going to suffer there. But if you won at a raffle this pot with all this stuff in it, the first thing I do is go home and separate it out and put it in different containers. That's just not gonna work. Irrigation. With pots, you kind of have two options. You can water by hand, or you can do some kind of drip irrigation. I suppose you could do a sprinkler if it was in a yard, but I don't think that's a good idea. Watering by hand can be really satisfying. You, first of all, can customize it to the weather. So during a cool week, you can do less. I mean, it's just easy to customize. I know people who like to go out in the morning, they water their plants, they look at them, they talk to them, you can check for, you know, early signs of pest and disease because you're looking at them all the time. You really want to do this in the morning, and you want to keep your hose pressure low. Try to keep the water at the soil level. Try to avoid mud splashes. That's again how some of the pathogens and diseases get up into the plant. Again, that's just one way to do it, and you have to decide if that's for you. I will say, because I often am running out working, I sometimes water in the afternoon. And, you know, if the plants aren't stressed and there's still enough sun and there's good air circulation and I keep the water down low, I haven't had a problem. But really, best practice is in the morning. Drip irrigation, I like emitter line that runs all the way around a plant. An emitter line is black tube where water drips out every so many inches. If you're in the Bay Area, Urban Farmers sells emitter line where the water comes out every 6 inches. I know a lot of the big home building stores have irrigation line that's every 12 inches. But for smaller things, the 6 inches is more convenient. I like it better than say one little bubbler or whatever, because I like to get water all the way around the root ball. And it's a little bit flexible. It's easy to make it wider, smaller, make sure I get the whole area of the root ball. For me, I've seen not so much vegetables, but other plants where they've put in one little bubbler on one side of the plant, and inevitably either it's stressed because half of its roots aren't getting water. I know they sort of move to the side, you know, the water kind of wicks over to a degree, but it doesn't hit the other side of the pot or the other side of the root ball. Or the plant starts to grow closer and closer to that bubbler and either cuts it off or, you know, some other problem. So ideally, I think if you can't get emitter line like this, at least 2 bubblers, at least both sides of the plant. And then you're more likely, you know, to keep most of the root ball moist. And it needs that water to help transfer nutrition from the soil to the roots. So it's really important. You can, if you don't like the look of this coming over a pot, you can put it up through the drainage hole. You just want to be careful. Master gardeners in our area, and probably in a lot of areas, will have workshops on drip irrigation. Obviously last year, there probably haven't been many, but a lot of places will do a hands-on or at least a face-to-face situation to teach you about drip irrigation. It's pretty easy. This, though, about irrigation is the most important thing you will ever learn. Dry soil is hydrophobic and is really hard to get wet again. Once a root ball dries out, it's full of air. And as my little diagram there shows, you're putting water in and it's coming out the bottom and you figure, well, the whole thing's wet. But actually all the roots have all these little air bubbles in there and they're not getting the water they need. To rehydrate, you have to do a bunch of things, but it's really important. You want to slowly add water, allow that to be absorbed, add a bit more water. You want to periodically, especially if your plant's looking stressed or maybe you were gone for a while or a heat wave. For example, if you're watering along and your plant is fine and then a heat wave comes, but you don't change the amount or frequency of your watering, you may have developed some parts of a dry root ball. The easiest thing to do is to stick your finger down a couple inches or a chopstick or some other small, you know, implement and see what it looks like. Or you can water, and if the water's kind of slow to go down, sometimes if you've got enough water there and you poke a hole, you'll see little puffs of dry soil come up as it sort of breaks up some of those air pockets. It can take, I'm trying to think, because we've done this recently for some citrus trees. I mean, it could take 20 minutes to feel like you really have a well rehydrated plant. And way back to that very first citrus I showed you in the really big pot that had the flowers around it, that got dehydrated once. It was on drip and that got messed up. Well, actually it got hot and they didn't increase the amount of water they were giving it. And that did take us, and that was really a sad tree. I mean, it had dropped leaves and looked terrible. And it took us 30 minutes. I mean, literally elbow deep, massaging it to get the water in there and to get it hydrated. And then we just gave it, you know, good fertilizer, and then made sure it was kept up, and it revived really well. It really bounced back great. But you kind of don't want to get to this point, because it's when it's stressed that, again, they get disease or pests, or they just, you know, give up. So you want to try to avoid this. And specifically with things like tomatoes or peppers or some of these things, well, cucumbers and eggplant, they can get dry and bitter. And if you ever have one that is, you know that they didn't get enough water, or they didn't get consistent water. Now, if you're growing your cucumbers, I do know that, you know, let's say you thought you were doing a good job and they sort of seem good, and that first piece from the end is bitter, sometimes the middle is not. So, you know, if you've grown it and you don't want to throw the whole thing out, I would taste the middle and see how it is, maybe peel it. Tomatoes, if they're too wet, they get this blossom rot, or your fruit are nice and, you know, mature, and all of a sudden they split because they got a big influx of water. They also get blossom rot if they don't have enough water. It's all about absorbing calcium. And same things happen with squash, which I find really frustrating, because I always think I'm doing a good job, and all of a sudden it's pollinated, it starts to grow, and then it all dies back. Consistent, the best you can do is really helpful. So I've added a couple of things that are just things I've done, because in past presentations, people ask, what do you do about deer, squirrels, whatever? Well, I use this netting tool like you find in a bridal fabric section. It's generally under $5 a yard. You know, with a coupon or a sale, you can get it really cheap. You could get it at Halloween, and great colors, whatever. I like it because it's very thin, so the sun and the air come through, and it's easy for me to operate. It doesn't get stuck on branches or fruits and pull them off. I use clothespins if I want to close them up. And I have found, but you need a structure so that the netting is a little bit ideally beyond your plant, because I'm not convinced that a really angry squirrel might not just eat your netting to chomp your tomato. Inevitably in my yard, we don't have deer all summer. The tomatoes just start to turn red, and they feel the need to taste a few. So that's about when I start to throw this stuff on, keep it out away from the fruit a little bit. And that seems to, you know, to at least be helpful. And it's an option, because, you know, those repellents, and everybody's got their own idea, doesn't always work. And the bird netting that you buy sticks to everything. And I personally find that frustrating, whereas the netting I can reuse from year to year. And then this is something, this is ugly, but this is something we did last year because we had a lot of wind. I live at the bottom of a hill that used to have lots of big trees, and they just clear cut it because they're building a development. So all of a sudden the winds came up and it was crazy. So I bought shower curtains and sort of put them around the midsection of all my pots there. And I used duct tape and attached it to the trellises, and added a few slits in there so that the wind does go through a little bit. Otherwise, you know, you're knocking everything over. But it really protected my plants, and it also increased the warmth, which again, I live somewhat near the coastal area, so that was really helpful for me. And it was really great. So I suppose you could do something like that too for deer, whatever, as long as your plants were farther back, you could build some barrier. But for us, wind was an issue. Let's see. Okay, we're getting near the end and then we can do questions. Harvest your crop, pick stuff. If you don't keep picking stuff, then your plant thinks it's made enough to put out into the universe and it slows down. Things like beans, pole beans, boy, we go through times where I feel like I'm pulling many every day, certainly every other day, and I'm boggled by the number it can produce. So you definitely want to keep up on that. Permanent things, you want to give them a shower every once in a while just to get that dust off. Also for permanent plants, you want to rotate them a quarter turn every quarter or something. You see this tree here where it was facing in one direction and never got turned, and you get that lopsided pruning. Growing. For pots, I wrote root prune every 2 to 4 years. It's really once it's so dense in there that you just can't get a finger down in it, or it's dry all the time, you're needing to water it all the time. And then watch for pests and treat things quickly. There are a lot of great organic ways. I always put these 3 little bugs at the bottom and ask people if they can figure out which ones are bad and which ones are good. Just because from my experience, I made the wrong choices. So this is the larva of a ladybug, which we all know they eat aphids. So we like the larva. This is the intermediate stage before they turn into those beautiful ladybugs. This is a soldier beetle. These were on some roses of mine, and I thought, oh my God, what are they? I had the aphids and then I had those, and I thought they must be bad. And lo and behold, whereas the cute little yellow ladybugs and the striped ones are both cucumber beetles and bean beetles, and they're bad. They not only eat, but they carry disease from plant to plant. So you can't tell a bug by its cover. And master gardeners are great at helping you figure that out. You can send pictures to them. There's a couple websites here, our main website, and then the UC Davis for integrated pest management. Personally, I also like the public library, at least in our area. We have a big network and you can go online and request books. And even during the pandemic, we've been able to request books and then pick them up. Lyngso has really good composts and soils and fertilizers. And I've had that on there even before I was speaking at Lyngso. So I really like their products, and they really care about the environment and the kind of soils and composts and what they do. And then that's the book Pam Pierce, if you're in this area. It hasn't been updated in 11 years, but it's basic information. And then I love independent nurseries, wherever they are. I just found like those are people who've been in the area, they know their region, they know their product. Generally, they're very knowledgeable and want to be helpful. And then I think, and finally, this is in the area. We aren't open. Our helplines aren't open. You can't walk in, but you used to be able to bring materials, but you still can email questions, pictures of your problems. You can, call them, and they're really good at researching and getting back to you and trying to find out, what they can do to help solve it. So that's it, Cam. I'm happy to answer. Are there questions?
Thank you, Laurel. Yeah, there are a few questions. We had some technical difficulties for the past hour or so.
Oh,
but
man.
I think that's okay. Good thing the class is recorded, so it's available to watch anytime. But let's address some questions. I responded to several folks directly, but let's go over some of the questions in the chat. I may be skipping over a few, so apologies if I do. In the beginning, someone asked about wine barrels. What are your thoughts on growing in wine barrels?
You know, the wine barrels are probably fine. I know they sell wine barrels, and I saw them at Home Depot the other day. And I would assume they're fine. I'd probably like to make sure that they were only used as wine barrels. I mean, that's food, so they have to be food safe. I would just make sure they weren't used for anything beyond that.
Sure, that's fair. Okay, so the next question is, I've heard many times that soil and containers need to be changed periodically. Is there a way to amend the soil in the container instead, or replace it and amend it outside the container?
So, yes. So again, it's like, if you've studied gardening, they talk about, or farmers, they rotate their crops. If you grow anything too long in the same place, not only do certain elements get depleted, but it increases the chance of certain pathogens, blights, whatever to happen. So if you're talking about something that's going to be in there long term, a blueberry, a citrus or whatever, you can just probably add a little compost on top to revive the soil. Or, you know, if you're going to put it in a bigger pot, just add a little more potting soil. You know, what I was saying before, if I've grown something, this is not the official line. This is my personal line. If I've grown something and not had any problem with it, I might just take out a little bit and then, you know, top it or add new potting soil, or add some compost, some finished compost into it, you know, to pump it up a bit. Another way to sort of get around that is, maybe if one time I've grown a tomato in a pot, the next time I might grow some pole beans. So I sort of do my own soil rotation within a few pots without, you know, it's not perfect, but without having that problem of generating a blight or something. But yeah, you can add compost or soil amendment. If you do soil amendment, I think you want to do that earlier in the season, allow it to start to decompose a little bit and really add something to the life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know in previous classes, especially in our pruning classes, I'm thinking of Arnie Corness's pruning class. He did a fabulous demonstration of root pruning, where he actually, you know, took the plants out of the container and then prune the roots, repot it with some fresh compost amendments, and put it back in the container. So that just sort of limits the growth of certain herbaceous plants, really, and dwarf trees and such. So
yeah, for all of those, that's the kind of thing we do. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is, what really is the difference between like vermiculite and perlite and using it in soil mixes? I know vermiculite tends to store water, perlite helps drainage. Really, what is your preference? What are your thoughts on that?
I probably should know more about this than I do. I like vermiculite because it doesn't blow all over the place. Perlite, I feel like every time I open that, you know, because it's puffed. It's great for drainage and air circulation. But I found that because we do a lot of flowers, and so the growers all have their own blends, and some of them use a lot of that white perlite. After we've planted maybe a year of four seasons of plants, you start to notice the perlite all kind of comes to the top. It like floats to the top every time you've watered and used it. And so I'm just always scraping it off to try to get more soil in there. So I haven't loved perlite. I kind of find it, I mean, it's got its uses, I'm sure. I don't want to knock it for people that don't. For vermiculite, I feel like it helps with you know, it supposedly retains soil moisture, but actually it's not something that's going to make it soggy. It's good for also, I think, for circulation. So I'm a vermiculite person.
Yeah, yeah. I tend to, I try not to use either of them because of the sustainability aspect of using that product. And plus, I don't like to see white specks all over the soil as well. So, you know, using horticultural lava or pea
Yeah.
gravel is probably better. But if you prefer that, no problem. You can use perlite and vermiculite. It is much lighter than the other mineral options that are available. So it's a personal preference at that point, I think.
And I'm sorry. And I will say, I almost never use them. I know I mentioned them for the succulents, and that's because I find a lot of the succulent mixes drain or dry out too fast, just as I said, because nobody ever waters them. So I like them to have a little water retention. So yeah, I'll buy like I don't even know what, you know, the small bag, and that'll last me 2 years. So yeah, I agree.
Okay, so moving on to a next question here. What are your thoughts on growing tomatoes in, 5-gallon plastic nursery containers?
That it's a challenge, and I've tried it. If you can't get anything bigger, I grow in a lot of nursery containers because I have them. And actually nowadays some places you can buy them, but you really want at least, I would say, a 15-gallon. 5-gallon, you can get a cherry tomato, or, again, what they're calling a patio tomato plant. You will not get the growth or the harvest, but you can do it. I mean, if that's all you have, you will get something. You will probably need to water it more often. You may, organic fertilizer is really the way to go. I don't know if there's any reason to do it more often, but you might need to find a liquid fertilizer because they're going to be challenged.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you there. I like growing in sort of a larger container anyway, but it can be achieved if you are feeding the plant constantly and watering it and nurturing it. So it's a little bit more care at that point. What about how big of a container do you need for, say, blueberries to be grown in?
Okay. It kind of depends on the blueberry plant, but I have the last 2 that I grew in pots actually got pretty darn big, and they were the Sunset has some new variety out there the last couple years. Beautiful Bounty or some, cute name. And I had it in a, I think eventually it was probably like an 18 by, I don't know if it was 18 deep, but an 18-inch wide by maybe 16-inch deep pot. The thing with blueberries, like a lot of acidic plants, their roots go wider than deep. So you can go with a wide pot that isn't as deep. But it really did fill that up. But it lasted, and I had great production for about 5 years before I decided to put it in the ground, just because we had cleaned out a whole area, and I wanted actually to put more blueberry bushes in and get more. We like blueberries in our house, but yeah, again, I would say for something like that, long-term 18 inches, you could probably start. There are some like an O'Neill or some of the Berkeley blue. You could probably start with a I'm sorry, like a 14-inch by 12-inch, but you're gonna want to eventually move up.
Yeah, because blueberries tend to sort of like bush out a little bit as they grow, and I've grown them both in ground and in containers as well. And I almost in a way prefer containers because I feel like I can sort of shape it the way that I want
Yeah.
and not let it get too wild.
You can, I will, let me just say, there are now like southern and high bush and combos, that two things. One, you could root prune a blueberry. So, you know, if you want to keep it in a pot and you're happy with however much you get from that size pot, then, you know, if it gets too big, just root prune it and then redo it. The other thing is these ones from Sunset, not have to look up the names of them. They actually hold a pretty tight habit. They aren't going all over the place like the kind I know what you're talking about. But yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, you're right. I guess it depends on the variety, and how really wide and tall it gets. So you could try either or. Okay, so next question is, do you have any recommendations for supports, plant supports, for, especially for tomatoes or other sort of veggies that are heavy, cages perhaps, or stakes?
I don't have a particular brand, or I will say that the smaller tomato cage is probably not big enough that you see a lot of places. Well, okay, there's two kinds of tomatoes. There's lots, but determinate and indeterminate. Determinate grow for a limited point, you know, time, put on one big flush of fruit, and then they're kind of done. I don't think those get as big as the indeterminate, which I think is what most of the tomatoes you grow are. Those can get amazingly big if they're in the ground. They're less so in a pot. If I'm using sort of that V-shaped, you know, circular thing, which you definitely want to put on when you plant, because believe me, it's really hard otherwise. I try to there are some that are bigger now. I also try to find ones that are sturdy if you think you're going to do it time and time again, but you want something that's going to get, you know, that's tall once it's in the ground, maybe at least 4 feet, because those plants will get up and out. I also have seen either people have built or maybe they buy sort of a square box, you know, that you can stick over the whole pot, because the reality is with tomatoes, they really keep going. So you want something for that and wide support, whether you're going to tie it up to a taller piece or not. Sometimes I'm just kind of like crazed and I've got like a tomato in a pot with its cage, but then it's sent out long arms. And so I've taken another tomato cage and either turned it upside down with the prongs out, and then I've like flattened them to make supports, or, you know, I've done just all kinds of crazy things. So I apologize that there's not one standard answer, but bigger and taller. Yeah.
Okay, it depends on the tomato variety as well, right? There's so many different varieties of tomatoes.
There are, but you know, what did I grow? Sunset Gold, Sun Gold, a cherry tomato, which you would think they usually don't get that big, but mine was like 5 feet tall and yeah, reaching. So
yeah. You must have really good soil then, Laurel. Good food.
Well, potting soil. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on to a different question here. So I have a standalone garden bed containers that were not used for a couple years, so now have a lot of weeds growing. Do I need to empty out all the soil, or can I put weeds and amend soil to use again? Or pull the weeds and amend the soil to use again?
I guess if you're fairly certain that neighborhood cats didn't use it as a, a litter box, I'd pull the weeds. I might take off the top couple inches because of other weed seeds but I might just take off the top couple inches. And then I guess I would look at the soil. If you think it's still, if you find worms, if it's got moisture down there, if it just smells good or not bad, I might just add amendment and fluff it up, or whatever makes sense. Amendment and compost, some combination, and then you don't want to till the whole thing, but maybe work it in the first couple of inches there. So but I would definitely consider using it, but you'd kind of have to investigate.
Yeah. So on the same line of questioning, if they have a disease in a planter where they've grown vegetables mostly, can you dump the used soil into the garden, disinfect or repot? Or if you're dumping the contaminated soil into the garden, wouldn't the problem just transfer over to the other plants in the garden? How do you deal with situations like that?
Well, boy, there's probably more components to this than I might get right. Well, I would take all the soil out, because I think that's probably what you'd have to do. I'm assuming you can take the soil out, and maybe, I don't know if you can clean the sides of the if it's a raised bed, you might have to leave it open to the sun for some amount of time, or that's something I don't really know, and you might want to contact the master gardener office specifically, but I'd take this, you definitely want to take the soil out. Then sometimes pathogens don't always work across other species. So what might hurt a tomato might not hurt a boxwood or whatever. I'm not sure about that, but specifically tomato and boxwood, but that's kind of what happens. So I think you have less chance, but I'd probably take all that soil, put it aside somewhere for a summer. If you cover it, solarization, you put black plastic or clear plastic, I think are the two best, and get it in the sun and let it overheat, it's going to kill most of that stuff, or all of that stuff. So that would, and then you'd have soil that you could use again. Mm-hmm. But that would, and then, well, I wouldn't do it in the raised bed, because I'm not sure how far down the solarization works. So you wouldn't want a 2-foot pile of dirt. You'd want dirt kind of probably spread out so that really helps all the way down.
Yeah. And also, I think it's important to identify what the contamination is as well, whether it was like a fungal infection or a bacterial infection or whatever it may be, or some other, soil virus or something,
Yeah.
Maybe good to get like a soil test at that point to see if it's a bigger issue.
Yeah, and that's also the premise, I'm sorry, between the soil, crop rotation, because it's about, if you had tomato blight that came up, farmers don't necessarily leave that field fallow, but then they do something that's not affected by tomato blight. So, but I agree, you want to kind of know, you're good to know what you had. And
Okay, so then the next question is, this one's sort of an open-ended question, I believe, but could you grow 2 bush tomato plants in an 18-gallon container about 20 inches across? Not sure what a bush tomato plant is, but
it's either probably a determinate or a small, 18 inches wide or 18 gallon.
18-gallon container that's about 20 inches across.
You could try. I mean, again, I've done that. You know, if they really are pretty small varieties, you might be okay. Again, I think towards the end, you're probably giving them a little extra liquid fertilizer and attending to them. But I've got a pot out there actually. I know it's so tempting. You got that tiny little plant, and even if yeah, I mean, you could try. I'm not going to tell you you're going to have your best production, but you could probably get through the summer with that.
Yeah. And I think my experience has been sometimes one plant will do really well, and it kind of creates that competition, and the other one just sort of, you know, one really dominates the other one. So kind of be mindful of that. Maybe they'll both do great. So it's trial and error.
Yeah. And, you know, I've heard, I know out now is the time that there are all those articles like put eggshells in and do all this stuff. And I've been told like eggshells don't really decompose fast enough to be used. Maybe you have a different feeling on that, but I just want to mention, and I don't understand the aspirin thing or fish heads. I mean, they may all be good next year, but that generally this year, they don't really get into the soil life well enough.
Yeah. Well, I you know, my preference is always throw everything in the compost bin, let it compost, and then use the compost.
Exactly. Yeah. And then that's more available to the plants too.
Yeah.
So.
Precisely. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So this person bought a plastic container from Costco that doesn't have a recycle number at the bottom. It's by Southern Patio Plastic, and it has a very strong plastic smell. And they're wondering if that would be safe to grow vegetables, especially leafy greens like lettuce.
So they bought it as a container. It sounds like Southern Patio sounds like they sold a container for assuming it was sold as a container, not as some storage bin or something. I think that would be fine. What I'd probably do is you know, maybe wash it and then put it out in the sun for a couple of days, see if it, you know, it should be fine, because they would be obligated if they sold it as a container and there was a problem, they'd be obligated to tell you not to grow things in it. I mean, they'd be liable. So I'm sure that it's fine.
Yeah. Okay. I think the other thing for me is if you're growing in any sort of plastic containers, what are your thoughts, Laurel, on full sun being exposed to dark plastic containers and just really getting hot? And, you know, sometimes I feel like it's really not the best way to put it out in the sun. I mean, maybe if you have like part shade and it doesn't really get, sometimes where I live, it gets over 100 degrees during summertime, you know.
Well, okay. Yeah. See, I live like up 280 and 92. So we get all the coastal fog. So I have sort of a different situation. So plastic in general can sometimes get brittle. The dark ones, the black nursery pots, I think they can handle the heat because they use them. And and they use them over and over. So the problem there is if it gets too hot, if you live somewhere where it's 100 degrees, I probably wouldn't be growing something in full sun and black, because that extra heat, it's gonna cook the roots. Now, where I live, I never have that problem. And in fact, it's often too cool. So the black plastic isn't a problem. I do know in general, like I'll use a rubber, you know, a big storage container. I'll use it for my tools out there, throwing weeds in and that stuff. And those plastics do break down over time and become very brittle. So, And nowadays there are some really nice, attractive pots made out of, I don't know what it's made out of, like it almost feels like paper mache or something, but there's a lot of nice pots out there that are lightweight besides plastic. But
Yes.
it's more the heat that I'd worry about with a container, in those situations.
Yeah, yeah. I do like those felt containers to grow them in as well. But anything that you can reuse, it's worth a try. I just bring that up because there were issues in the past with leaving it in the full sun, and I never do that. And I
Oh,
start my starts in smaller containers and then transplant them to terracotta or ceramic, or even in the garden beds directly. But all right, so moving on to a next question is, do you have any suggestions for growing herbs like basil, parsley, cilantro, etc., in containers? And what do you recommend the size of the containers be for those herbs?
okay. For things that are sort of annuals, parsley, cilantro, basil, you can grow them in fairly small pots. Probably 8 by 8 might be the smallest. I might, try to get something 10 by 10 or something like that. I mean, you can grow them bigger. You could put them in some of them you could grow in a 5-gallon container and they'll keep growing, but you could do smaller if you don't have the space. The things about them are, for me, they've been counterintuitive. I've never met a cilantro that didn't bolt, no matter what it was called. So if anybody out there has an idea, in fact, you think these all want really hot sun. My basil always seems to be happier with afternoon shade. Even then, again, you think Italy out in the sun all day. What's the problem? But parsley actually, it actually does do happiest in some shade. I don't think parsley really likes the hot. It can grow fall, spring, I mean, some other times a year, but that's one for this, definitely for the shade, and it'll go. That'll be the one that goes longest. There are some perennial basils. They have slightly different tastes, but I know one of the dark ones, I don't know if it's African blue or not. I've grown in part shade because I had to. That was my only option, and it did better than you'd think. Yeah, if anyone has solved the cilantro issue, I would like to know. Otherwise, with cilantro, I think it's cheaper to buy it at the supermarket. But
I tend to grow my cilantro from seeds, the coriander seeds, and they do very well. And you're right, they always end up blooming. And I try to, deadhead them or cut the little blooms off. But they do tend to get bushy, but they're just so easy to grow. I just sprinkle some seeds and they just grow anywhere, really.
well, that's good to know.
Okay, so the next question is, do you have any suggestions for removing citrus trees and blueberry bushes from containers that are too large to tip over? The citrus are in large concrete containers, and the blueberries are in large troughs. Troughs. Not sure how to get the plants out without harming them in order to trim the roots and add new soil. So any suggestions there?
Okay, so for the blueberry, well, I think in both cases, you're probably gonna have to shave them a little bit. Okay, first of all, anybody who doesn't already have a pot, anything that has this curved lip, like urns and stuff, or olive, Grecian olive oil cans or whatever, they're the worst to pull something out of because all the roots stick underneath the lip. So ideally, you either want it flared out or up if you think something's going in and out. I'd start with a hori knife, which is a like Japanese gardening knife, and it's serrated on one side, and I'd probably go around the edge. So in the trough, if you've got more than one blueberry, I'd probably try to section it off. If you've cut off a little bit of the root ball, that's probably okay because you're root pruning anyway. So I'd start with going around the edge of the pot, and I'd also then, this will be tedious, take out small amounts of dirt along the side as I go down as best you can. At some point, I'm trying to think, with the blueberries, if it's a trough and you can get into it, like stand into it after you've sort of cut down maybe 12 inches, and maybe you need to use a saw at some point or something to really cut those, because they're going to be a lot of tight little ones. I might try to get a shovel or something down under and start to lift one side and then the other. I think watering them first while making them heavy is probably going to be better for the shock of it. And I'd certainly, as soon as you got them out, not spend a day or two with them out waiting to go back in with some, like a starter fertilizer or some compost tea or something to help with that shock. The tree, yeah, I mean, you really kind of have to just slowly pull out soil and, as best you can. Eventually you'll get down low enough that maybe you can tug it. You may not get it all, but it's kind of the best you can do. Now, if you've got a big pot and you think you don't want to put it on its side because it'll scratch or whatever, we have taken big pots, loosen them and then taken a big pot and laid it down on, a series of sheets or tarps or some kind of padding so they don't scratch. And then that makes it much easier. I mean, sometimes one of us is sitting on the pot and the others, got their feet on the lip and yanking. It can get crazy, but ideally, if you can do something like that, that helps.
Yeah. And again, I'm going to refer to the pruning class that's available under community resources. In that class, you'll see a demonstration of actually taking a difficult plant out of its pot. And what Arnie had used was this, I'm forgetting the tool's name, but it's an electric, sort of a little metal blade that prunes trees and branches and stuff. You use the same thing and go along the container and then make sure to loosen the dirt and roots that are stuck to the container. And then it just comes right out. It's a bit intimidating.
It is. Actually, it sounds like it's the old electric carving knives that that's not that's my generation. But the other thing that can be a problem though, especially like with a citrus tree, is sometimes that woody root will go down and get through the hole. Yeah. The tap root. And then it's hard because I'm not sure. I mean, then you'd sort of have to almost cut underneath, and depending on how tall it is, I don't know how well you can, cut underneath, but just know that. So yeah, that's great. If there's already a video with that, you should take a look at root pruning. It's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we'll do a couple more questions. I skipped over a few, but we'll do a couple more questions before the end of the class here. What's your opinion of grow bags over containers?
Well, the only time I try them, the fabric ones, like.
Yeah.
I thought that my soil dried out faster. Now they're kind of handy if, they're kind of handy if you just wanted to grow one thing for a short period of time. I don't know what they're like long term. I mean, I feel like they'd eventually decay. And again, in my case, the one I tried, certainly they evaporate or lose moisture. Also, like potatoes was what they were originally for, and it was sort of a great idea, but they don't, obviously I'm not in love with them because they also don't stay up. They can sort of shift. I don't feel like they have the structure to hold something very big on top.
Sure.
I mean, also they're not, to me, the advantage of a container, if it's semi-attractive, and that can be terracotta, is that it could be anywhere. People can see you growing whatever you want, but the pot adds a certain aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's totally fair. I'm not a huge fan of grow bags either, or felt bags are sort of harder to work with. And you're absolutely right. It does tend to kind of dry out because it is sort of porous and it lets air in through the sides as well, which is kind of neat for, like you said, potatoes and other applications, but for growing other crops may not be the best thing. So the next question is strawberries. What type of container and size of container do you recommend for strawberries? I know the typical strawberry pots are just almost aesthetics and comical in a way.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Those are like, I think, a one season thing. Okay, I'm not an expert on strawberries, but the best thing I ever grew them in, which probably wasn't food safe, was a kid's kiddie pool. Because the thing with strawberries is you get the mother plant or whatever, and it sends out runners. And you need to read on this. And I like websites that are either from university extensions or some, actually SF Gate has a decent, and they're related to the Chronicle, has decent gardening information locally, but some of the established, gardening companies will sometimes have it, but every state has a university extension for agriculture and usually has some kind of public information. So they send out runners. At some point, you want some of those runners to reroot. So something wide, like a raised bed, you don't need deep, you just need shallow. Otherwise, you've got to have like lots of little pots next to each other so that they reroot. And then you cut them, and then those produce fruit, and it's a whole chain, because that same one plant, I'm not sure how many years that continues to produce fruit. There's something sort of cyclical about it. But anyway, I do know you want shallow and wide.
Shallow and wide. That's fantastic. Yeah, agreed on that. Okay, so there are a couple questions regarding cover crops, but we have a really great class on cover crops under our community resources. Do check that out. But I think we're going to wrap this up, and I want to thank everybody for being here and bearing with the technical difficulties of Eventbrite and Zoom today. But this class, again, is being recorded and will be posted on our website as well. And thank you, Laurel, for an awesome class. And I know you didn't see the chaos in the chat, and you kept it really cool, which is great.
Wow.
But it was a wonderful class, and thank you for being here and doing the class for Lyngso.
Sure.
Yeah, and thank you everybody again, and we'll see you on our other class, which is in 2 weeks from today.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Laurel. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.